Okay, good morning. My name is Leslie Kurth. Along with me in my office is Travis Young. He'll be presenting here in a moment, and then Brim Jarvis, who's joining us virtually as well. Today, we would like to talk about negotiating contracts with industry sponsors, things including such as initiation, standard operating procedures, and the actual negotiation of the project. So first off, I would like to kind of go over what a negotiator does here at SRS. So the role of the contract negotiator is to protect the interest of the A&M system as a whole, but also to evaluate and consider the impact of the agreements that we enter on how that will impact the researcher, how it will impact the student, the system member, and also subrecipients that we might sub part of the work with. Essentially, when we get a contract, we're looking at the terms and conditions to make sure that they're in compliance with all A&M system policies and processes or SAPs. We're also making sure it complies with all local, state, and federal regulations. We look at, we're occasionally asked by proposals to look at RFPs or requests for proposals. And in those applications, at times, we have to review those and object to any terms and conditions at the time of proposal, because once and if it's selected for funding, they sometimes won't let us negotiate any further on those terms and conditions. So sometimes we have to enter in very early on in the process, actually in the RFP process. But other things that we typically do too, depending on what the contract says, sometimes we will have to engage with other offices on campus. And those include things like the Office of General Counsel, Technology Commercialization, that used to be TTI, risk and management for like insurance issues, and also, IRB, ICUC, things like that. And we also work with the system member offices to go over things that might be a financial or reputational risk to the department or to the member. In those types of instances, we also seek member approval for IP and IDC waivers, cost sharing, termination language, high risk standard or non-standard terms that, like I said beforehand, could provide or could cause reputational or financial risk to the members. The other things we do is we will track the agreement all the way to full execution. And at that point in time, we'll hand it off to our award setup team, and they'll start setting up the account. But that's essentially what a negotiator does. Now, there is a slight difference in how we process things based on if it's an industry versus a non-industry partner. And essentially, there's two buckets on that. Our office, or SRS, is responsible for negotiating all agreements with federal, state, and nonprofit entities. However, we do negotiate industry contracts for Texas A&M University, the Health Science Center, Galveston, Texas A&M Transportation Institute, and Prairie View. We also negotiate non-sponsored agreements for Texas A&M, Health Science Center, and Galveston. However, if you are in one of the other members, such as AgriLife, Tees, things like that, then you have a contracting office that will negotiate all industry agreements for you. And also for like AgriLife, we have commodity agreements. The Ag Contracting Office can help you with those. And then those contracting offices also work with you on if an MTA is needed and materials are going to be exchanged during the work or during the project. If a non-disclosure agreement is needed on the front end, say like when you're talking about an RFP or entering into a project with someone, we have things as well, like they'll help you with an MOU or an MOA or teaming agreements, things that you might do on the front end before funding actually comes in. But in that case, essentially, SRS would be your go-to point for all federal, state, and nonprofit. And then if you happen to be in at the university or Health Science Center, Galveston, TTI, Prairie View, we'll help you with everything on that pretty much. However, if you happen to be in Tees and AgriLife, they will help you with your industry or commodity agreements. Why would a faculty member here at Texas A&M want to work with an industry partner? Well, as we all know, federal funding is getting increasingly competitive and funding opportunities are sometimes, far and few between. And so industry provides funding and additional sources of revenue for faculty for their research. It also provides a link for students to connect with maybe potential future employers. And so that's one of the reasons why faculty here at A&M would want to work with industry. Now, on the flip side, why would industry want to work with A&M? Well, oftentimes our faculty are doing cutting edge research that is on the forefront of technology and innovation. They want to have access to those. We also have faculty that are experts in their field. They're world renowned for those types of things, and so if you had a question that was specific to a certain area, of course you want to seek out the best person for or to help you answer that question. And so that's why they come to us. They also come to us sometimes when they have a problem with a product or a production issue or a process, or, maybe they've had a recall. And so they come to us in a time of crisis to help them solve their issue. The other thing that they come to us for is to help gain knowledge or help, develop something that will help them make money. They're all for the bottom line. And the other thing that they like to come to us for kind of goes with our last point, why we want to work with industry is that they like to have that inside track for potential employees. So maybe postdocs, graduate students, undergraduates, if they can get their foot in the door, they think they've got an edge over their competitor, they're more than happy to work with us. Ideally, when an industry sponsored project comes in, this is how it would go in a perfect real world scenario. The PI and the industry technical contact would meet, they discuss the scope of work. Next, the PI would contact the contracting office to, initiate the budget and the scope of work. Then we would send that back to the PI would send that to the industry sponsor. Then the industry sponsor, upon confirmation that everything's correct and everything, that it would then go for approval, and then the sponsor would say, yeah, we want to fund it, great. And then we would initiate a contract. The contract would be negotiated, and then we would hand it off to or release the project for account setup, and then SRS would handle everything there from the invoicing, project management, reporting, etc. Now, I would like to say that I said ideally. Oftentimes for industry, it does not follow this process whatsoever. Oftentimes, the contracting offices may not be aware that any discussions have been had, and the first time we have any kind of inclination or clue about that is when the contract hits our desk. And so, in other words, faculty member was at a conference, they we're visiting with an industry partner. They have over dinner, they say, hey, we have this problem. The faculty member says, oh, yeah, I can solve that. And it'll cost about, $50,000. And next thing you know, industry sponsor goes back to his company. They're like, yep. And all we know is the contract shows up. And so we've skipped a whole lot of steps that, are in this flow chart. So when it comes to us, sometimes we have to backtrack and do some different things, like we have to route the proposal because one wasn't routed, and we kind of have to play catch up to try to figure out where exactly, where we are in the process and stuff, and like what has the faculty discussed with industry so far? What have you agreed to verbally so far? And so we kind of play catch up, but ideally, this is how we would hope it would go. In the initiation of industry and non-industry projects, they're slightly different. So most of the non-industry contracts we receive are from entities such as federal and state entities, nonprofits. And in those, there actually is a request for proposals, or there's a competitive proposal process. And as you know, competitive proposals require a formal submission, and those are handled by SRS. Now, for industry, greater than 90% of the time, there is no request for proposal, so it's considered non-competitive. And like I said earlier, a lot of these are initiated through, people talking at conferences, having conversations on the phone, industry sponsors cold calling our faculty and asking them about it. And so essentially at that time, agreements and proposals are initiated at the same time. So that's kind of one of the little nuances between industry and non-industry. They're not done in a normal sequential order. They're sometimes done in tandem. It's really important as faculty that when you're being approached or you're being contacted or you reach out to an industry sponsor and you're talking about potentially your scope of work and your budget, it's important that you keep these things in mind if you're not routing a formal proposal prior to your conversations with them. You need to keep in mind the scope of work, the who, what, where, when, why, and how the research is going to be done. Could anyone off the street understand your scope of work? And so you're going to need a detailed scope of work. The next thing, and one of the crucial things in these conversations with the industry, is the budget. Of course, you want to account for your salaries, your friends, your travel, your supplies, things like that. But you also really need to be mindful of your indirect cost when you're talking to them. Ideally, for industry contracts, we would like you to build the IDC into the cost that you quote to the industry sponsor. Industry tends to fight us a lot when they see IDC listed as a separate line item. It is really beneficial if you can build the IDC into the cost that you're quoting to the sponsor. But oftentimes, too, we do have faculty that forget to include IDC whatsoever. And so when the contract comes in, IDC wasn't anticipated. Well, now we have to go back and tell them, oh, yeah, and on top of that, you've got to pay, another 52.5%, and they're not very happy about that. So if you keep that in mind, that would be great. The other thing, because a lot of industry contracts are fixed price or time and materials, things like that, what your deliverables and your timeline are, what you quote in those could impact the payment terms that we have in the actual contract. And also keep in mind too, if you're going to be exchanging proprietary or confidential information, or maybe even materials, if you're doing those types of things and you're sharing confidential information, or if you're going to be sending or receiving materials with an industry sponsor, there may be a need for a non-disclosure agreement or a material transfer agreement as well. So those are just things that we're asking that you just kind of please keep in mind when you're having those conversations with industry sponsors. Next, on that note, I'm going to hand it off to my partner here, Bryn Jarvis.
Morning, everybody. The unfunded agreements are kind of a little nuanced in our industry groups. I want to say that the typical unfunded agreements that we see that have differences with the industry groups are the non-disclosure agreements, teaming agreements, and memorandums of understanding. Generally, this is not an exhaustive list of the agreements that we do with industry sponsors. We also do MTAs, collaborations, data use, data transfers. But the terms of those agreements between industry and non-industry sponsors are fairly similar, so that's why they're not listed here. For the non-disclosure agreements, one of the major questions I get all the time is, can we sign an NDA for a project? What we stress is that an NDA should generally be used only for initial discussions across the board, especially with industry partners. They should only be used prior to the execution of a research agreement, a collaboration, or something of that nature, because NDAs with industry especially often expect things to be considered confidential that we as a university cannot remain confidential. They generally want the results to be confidential. They want the entire project to be confidential. They want the fact that there's an agreement being utilized to be confidential. And those are all terms that we can't agree to. Also, as a university system policy, we can't have an indefinite term of confidentiality. These are all things to consider when you start your discussion with your industry partners. Teaming agreements are a different animal of their own because these are generally used when an industry sponsor wants to engage with Texas A&M or another university on a request for a proposal. They know the proposal is coming and they want to have the initial discussions. So they want to make sure that they've got their groups locked down that they're going to do the project with after the proposal is submitted and accepted. Generally, you'll see a teaming agreement and an NDA together. What we see very often is that industry sponsors want to lock down exclusivity. They want to make sure that IP and things like that are covered, but that's not the correct agreement for those to be covered under. Also, things to keep in mind with the teaming agreement is that an industry will generally say Texas A&M as a whole will be exclusive to company XYZ, whereas we need to try and limit that down to a department, down to a PI, down to a specific group, because if we lock down the entirety of Texas A&M, it would cover everyone. And we're just such a large institution that there's no way to know that a PI in a totally different department isn't doing the same project with a totally different company. Memorandums of understanding are unique in that they're generally in agreement to agree at a later date. So they're very, very plain, very simple as far as the verbiage goes. What we see very often is that industry partners want payment terms, IP terms, deliverables, and the like all included in an MOU. But what an MOU's main goal is to say, we know we want to work together, and at a later date, we'll agree in writing to do so. So keep in mind that if you see an MOU, it should not include all the things that you know you're going to do in the research project at that time. In general, all of the unfunded agreements that we see with industry that are the precursor to a research agreement and true research projects should be very vague on terms and should not include things that you know are going to be in the research agreement later, because the main goal is to not have two different contracts that compete with each other or have differing terms. So I'll pass it on to Travis.
Thank you, Bryn. I appreciate that. What I'm kind of jumping, we talked about unfunded agreements. We talked about kind of the elements that start off the proposal that Leslie covered when you're dealing with an industry partner. So now I'm going to kind of jump into, okay, now we're at the contract stage. We're at the stage where, hey, we actually got a contract in place. We did what we're supposed to do, budget wise, proposal wise, whatever. So now we're working on a contract. Basically, what I have listed here are just kind of common elements that you see in all sponsored research contracts. These are seen in whether it's industry, nonprofit, state, whatever. You generally see these terms or these types of terms. You got to cover payment. How are we getting the money and when are we going to be paid? You got to cover intellectual property. Sometimes, if you have like a very, very simple agreement, you might not cover intellectual property, but most of the time you do. Typically, publications are something you're going to discuss is like, what are your rights to publish? How much, what kind of approvals do we need to get? What kind of, reviews do we need to give? Whatever, things like that. One of the important things, and Leslie mentioned this when she was talking about a detailed scope of work, you need to have some kind of listing or some kind of description of what your reports and deliverables are, because I've actually seen contracts go sideways when we have a very, very concise scope of work, and then down the line, what the sponsor thinks is a deliverable is not what the PI thinks is a deliverable. So it's very important in your scope of work or somewhere in the contract to clearly spell out what do we owe for the money we're being paid. Another thing that comes up in contracts is title to equipment, because a lot of times, it's more often seen in federal contracts, but you do see it some in industry contracts. Basically, who owns stuff when we buy it? If we get money to buy a piece of equipment, do we get to own it at the end of the project? Do they want to own it? Do we have to return it to them? Whatever. That is generally something we have to spell out in a contract. As Bryn mentioned, confidentiality is something that sometimes is handled on the front end, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's something that's handled in the body of the contract itself. And the same things apply. Things like, we can't have an unlimited term for confidentiality. We can't make results confidential, things like that. Those are all very important. Compliance. A lot of times you'll get a contract that says, what types of compliance do we have to follow in doing this work? Insurance is another thing. Sometimes we'll have to see, okay, what type of insurance is required. And another thing that comes up in a contract often is, how is a dispute going to be handled? Is what are the processes for handling disputes, and what governing law of what state or what country is going to govern this contract? Now, for industry contracts, there are some things that kind of raise red flags for us when we're looking at them. And these tend to be the most contentious issues to resolve when we're dealing with an industry partner. Most often, the number one issue that comes up is IP, because a lot of times industry wants to own any and all IP that's created with the project, or barring that, have very, very extensive use rights for any intellectual property that's created on the project. Another contentious issue can be publications, because they're very hesitant to publish things, especially that are not as favorable if the results don't go their way. Confidentiality, like Bryn mentioned and Leslie both, if there's, they want to basically make results confidential, things like that. Another thing that comes up that's kind of a red flag that we see a lot of in the industry contracts is satisfactory completion of work, wherein the industry partner wants to basically be completely satisfied with the results or they're not going to pay us. And that's a red flag. Other times they'll want us to assume risk and liability. So basically they try to shift the burden of risk onto the university through either indemnifications or liability statements that basically put as little burden of liability on the company as they can and shift it all to the university. And exclusivity is another thing that we see sometimes. And Bryn mentioned this, where even at the contract phase, they'll say, well, you're only going to work with us and no other competitors on this specific project. And between A&M and especially for other members, that's almost an impossible task. Payment terms are another issue that comes up sometimes, because definitely they want to delay payment as much as possible. Get as much as you can up front with as little payment up front as possible. I mean, hey, they're out to make money. That's what it is. IDC is another major contentious point, or it can be. And I will say this, it seems like with very large corporations, they've worked with enough universities that they understand IDC. But especially when you get with smaller corporations and smaller, what I call mom and pop shops, generally those entities will be less understanding of what IDC is. And that's why, as Leslie said, if we can develop a budget that has IDC in it, it's so much better if it's just rolled in and they don't have to see it as a separate line item. Now, I mentioned IP. I'm kind of going through a couple of these topics just to kind of line out, what they want and generally what we can do. With IP, I mentioned, basically they want to own everything. They say we're paying for it. We get to own every bit of IP that's created under this award. And, sometimes they'll say, okay, if we can't own it, we want an exclusive license to use it and only we can use it. No one else can use it. Or sometimes what they'll do is, okay, if barring that, they'll say we want to receive a significant percentage of any royalties that generate off of that. It's kind of like those are some of the different things that they'll want. The reality is, there's things they want, but the reality is, we generally operate under, when we work with federal sponsors, and which is the lion's share of what we do, we subscribe to Bayh-Dole, where we give the government rights to use things and for government purposes, but they still give us rights to license it and develop it commercially. So if they own everything created under the award, if there's any kind of mixing with any other work that's being done on a federal project, then that causes problems between the rights we owe to the federal government and the rights we owe to the industry. So that's why we have to be really careful about that. We as the system, the Texas A&M system, owns all intellectual property created by employees, whether they be Tees, TAMU, Agrilof, et cetera. We have to figure out if this is something that can be granted in this specific case. Another thing that's challenging sometimes we have to also relay is that if we give intellectual property ownership to a sponsor and also don't hold any rights back for the university, this can really curtail a faculty member, especially early in their career when they are, at the beginning stages of their career, they're just now developing. If they come up with a really cool idea that could basically carry them the rest of their tenure, then if the industry owns it, that basically just shuts off that avenue. So we want to really be careful about granting ownership of intellectual property for that reason, because it has happened, and we want to protect faculty from that scenario we can grant rights and we can do things like that, but granting them full ownership of everything is a bit of a risky proposition. For publications, typically what industry wants is they want to basically say, either you can't publish at all, that's kind of their perfect world, or they want to say, okay, we'll let you publish, but only if we give explicit approval. And you have to send it to us and we have to explicitly give you approval. Now, this causes a lot of problems for universities because, basically our bread and butter is we want to publish. I mean, it's part of our mission to disseminate scientific knowledge out to the broader community. Also, if we agree to publication restrictions like this causes us to violate what's called the fundamental research exemption, which is basically something that allows us to say, okay, our research results are not controlled under the export administration regulations. If we agree to withhold those and not publish them under language like this, then basically any results that we've created now are not exempt from export controls, and that causes issues that we have to monitor these through, technology control plans and things of that nature. Typically, what we want to do, and this is where we push back and say, okay, look, we need to publish. We can give you a right to review. We can give you a right to comment. We can give you a right to have input. But ultimately, the publication decision needs to be ours as a university. Typically, if we work with sponsors, most of the time we can come to some kind of agreement on this. Confidentiality, like Brent had mentioned before, a lot of times they want to say anything and everything's confidential, or they want to basically have a confidentiality period that lasts forever, in perpetuity. And, as a university and all system members, we have to follow the Texas Public Information Act, as well as FERPA and HIPAA regulations, which basically FERPA and HIPAA means we have to protect certain data, which, patient data or student data. And the Texas Public Information Act says basically we are obligated, if someone makes a request, to disclose things unless it is explicitly exempted under the act. That's the reality we have to live under. We have to let them know that we can't make things confidential both in perpetuity, and we also can't make, things like the terms of the agreement confidential. We can't make, results of the research because that would impinge our right to publish. And so we have to basically explain this sometimes, that these are the strictures we live under, and this is why we can't agree to things that they want us to agree to. Payment terms. This is where it gets a little bit interesting as well. What industry wants is, a lot of times, like I said before, if it's a larger company, generally they understand IDC and it's not as hard to explain. But a lot of times smaller companies want to not pay IDC. And that's a showstopper, because they also want to say, we want to basically, pay the least to get the most. I mean, it's a company. That's what they're doing. They're there to make money. And what we see sometimes is they also want to pay 100% once their work is completed and basically the deliverables have been submitted and it's satisfactory to whatever they deem satisfactory. And basically, if it's unsatisfactory, then they want us to redo it until we get it right. And the reality is, one, with IDC, we can't waive indirect costs, because basically, if we give the industry partner a better deal than we give the federal government, then that jeopardizes our federal funding. And that's, federal funding is sort of our 800-pound gorilla, and we can't do that. So this is why we had mentioned before, it's best to build the IDC into actual cost categories. So when you send a budget to the sponsor, it will just give them a bottom line. And this is another reason that, when Leslie had talked about the process of doing a proposal with industry, obviously it's kind of backwards sometimes, but before giving an actual number to an industry partner, say, this is how much a project will cost, it is best to work with a proposal administrator. They can give you a really quick and dirty budget, but it will be a loaded budget that has all of the categories, the IDC loaded into all of the categories so that they get a bottom line number. And it really avoids a bad conversation where we have to go back and say, PI said this would cost $100,000, but it's actually been $155,000. That's a conversation nobody wants to have. And it basically starts us off on a bad foot from day one. Another thing that basically they sometimes, sometimes they don't quite understand this. I mentioned cost reimbursable versus fixed price agreements. A lot of times we like fixed price agreements because they're simple. And it's a bottom line number, and industry likes that. However, sometimes they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say it's a fixed price agreement, but yet we have the right to come in and audit your agreement and see where you spent the money, and we want money back if you didn't spend it all on something. That's a big hard no, because we don't want to say, okay, you're paying a set price for this, but yet you still have the ability to come in and question what we spent the money on. And with fixed price agreements, because we have to have a little bit of cushion, sometimes we want to have at least 25 to 50% up front. And we only want to agree to basically a small amount contingent at the end. We're not going to agree to 100% payment at the end of the project, because that's basically doing what I call floating the note. We're doing all of the work 100% and then giving them the results, and then they're holding the check until we get paid. So it's basically floating the note for them. Yeah. And it's not a good way to do business. And it's also a very risky way to do business for the system members, because if they're not satisfied, they can withhold payment and things like that. And that kind of brings me to the last 2 points here. We can't subsidize our projects. That's causing us to subsidize them. And also, if they're not satisfied and they want us to reperform the work, that's a cost that's going to be incurred by the department in addition to what was originally anticipated. And this is why we can't agree to reperformance or, satisfaction guaranteed type terms. And I always like to say, you're not going to Walmart to buy something. You're doing research that is cutting edge, and we don't know the outcome. And if we don't get the results you anticipated, that's research. Another issue that's kind of a thing that typically comes up is risk and liability. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Typically, what industry wants is they want the university to assume all the risks. They want us to typically indemnify them to a fairly extensive degree. They want to have a pretty significant limitation on what they're liable for. They also want rights that indicate they can immediately terminate at any time. Like terminate November 21st, and you have to stop all work on November 21st. And another thing that causes some issues is sometimes if they do allow us to have termination, they want us to repay in full the entire amount of the award if we have to terminate. For instance, if a PI leaves the university and we have to terminate, they want us to refund all the money that's been spent over the last 6 months, 8 months, a year. And that's not going to happen because that was actually a cost that were incurred. So the reality is we really want to have some time to wind down a project. So we typically want to require at least 30 days advance written notice that the project's going to be terminated so we can wind it down. And we also try to include language that says, even with that notice, we have some right to recoup non-cancelable expenses so that if something has to go past that 30 days, that's a non-cancelable expense or something we couldn't terminate, like we ordered equipment is already here, whatever. That's something they're going to have to pay for. Our liability is limited based on Texas tort law. So when they want us to have, extensive insurance, or they want us to have, indemnify them, it's limited by Texas tort laws. And in the case of indemnity, we're not allowed to pledge a credit to the state of Texas to a third party in an indemnity. And since all TAMUS members are member agencies of the state of Texas, we don't have that authority. So we have to push back on that as well. And because basically what it does, it creates a debt, a sort of an unknown debt on the state of Texas by agreeing to these open-ended clauses. And that's why we have to push back on that and say, no, this is not something we agree to. Typically, we put something in there that says to the extent allowed by the state of Texas, which is basically not allowed at all. It's sort of and we explain that to them, but typically that will work. To close out the presentation a little bit, I kind of want to just say, in working with your contract negotiators, whether that be with the member office or with SRS, the most important thing is good communication between the investigator, the department, and, the member office negotiator or the SRS negotiator. And that ensures the best outcome for whether you're working with industry or non-industry. And I can't stress this enough. Presenting a united front between the investigator and SRS or the member contracting office is the best way to keep the negotiation from going off track and creating unnecessary delays. Because I have seen this happen where industry, if they hear one response from the investigator and one response from the university, they will try to play them off of each other. And it just delays things and it causes, needless trouble. So the final things I was going to leave folks with to remember is whether it's an industry contract and it's going down a different path than a typical RFP path, one of the things that we have to have is we have to have a proposal approved before the agreement can be signed. And the reason for this, a lot of times I've heard people say this is like, well, there's no RFP. We don't need to submit a proposal. In those cases, a proposal serves as a approval mechanism because even if we're not submitting an official proposal to the industry partner, like an official, like you would for a typical RFP, you still have to get department head, college, you have to get all of those approvals for the work that's going to be done. So the proposal serves as a routing device, if nothing else, to get the approvals from all the necessary people that are going to be handling the project, from the compliance, from all those other standpoints. We need to have all that stuff in place and make sure that it's going to work for the project to move forward. And that kind of brings me to the second point. Compliance issues have to be resolved before the work can begin. That's for all projects, industry or non-industry. If export approvals have to be obtained, animal approvals, human subjects research approvals, any of those have to happen. Contracts can be signed before those are done, but the work cannot begin until those are in place. And another thing that I wanted to stress is, please, at the faculty level, the agreements need to be signed by authorized officials in the university to make sure everything has been routed and approved in the way that it's supposed to. And agreements that are signed by a professor are not legally binding on the university. And basically, it's something that if something goes south, that's where, the professor can be held liable. So if there's something like this needs to go to the official office so that it can be reviewed and processed. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to David, and we can open up for questions.